It's time to take 10 minutes for Torah with Rabbi Joel Finkelstein.
Welcome to our discussion of Parashat Pekudei as commanded. We look in Parashat Pekudei, we find no less than 19 times that it says the Jews did kasher tzivah Hashem Moshe. They did as Moshe commanded, whether it's Bezalel or the Israelites as a whole. We did as God had commanded. In Parashat Vayakel, last week's Parsha, 6 times, same idea, that what the Jews did was as God commanded. Of course, we want to know that Mishkan was done as it was supposed to be. Why else would the Torah emphasize so many times as was commanded? The Sforno points out that they did it with the intent to do what God wanted. In other words, they didn't just happen to have done what God wanted, but they did it with the intent to do as God had commanded. The Ktav Sofer says, you might have thought that they did it with a different kavanah. Maybe they were trying to get atonement for the sin of the golden calf. No, they did it for the very purpose that God had commanded, so that God's presence would be found in our midst. Look in Mishmeret Ariel, Israeli scholar, he says that when Moshe gave them a blessing for what they had done, he saw what they had done. He saw all the work, and they had done it as Hashem commanded. Moshe blessed them. What did he bless them? So Rashi says, bless them that the divine presence should rest in the works of their hands. He says, when you do something at the will of God, you hope that it not only follows the will of God, but it fulfills the goal which God had set out for you. What was the goal? That God would dwell in your midst. So that's what Moshe says. Okay, you did it as was commanded, but will God now dwell in your midst? I pray that you didn't just make a nice house for God, but that God will actually dwell in it, among you, in this house for you. Rav Mital pointed out that at the same time that we're emphasizing over and again that they did exactly as was commanded, but Bezalel did not. Bezalel was told, do the kelim, do the aron and the menorah, the shulchan, then build the mishkan. And he said, no, you got to have a place to put it. You make the mishkan first, and then you do the aron. And Moshe said, wow, you're Bezalel, you live in Betzel Kel, you live in the shadow of God. You know what God wants you to do. You live in his shadow. We try to shadow God. If God says move left, we try to move left. We see God moving left, we try to move left. We move right. He moves right, we move right. He was in the shadow of God. He knew what God wanted. So at the same time that we strive to get it exactly right, we also have a broader vision. We're looking at it, we say, whoa, wait a second. If you do it that way, it's not going to work. It must mean to do it the other way, to do it slightly differently, to add that creative element that Bezalel and Oliav, the various architects, had, and that they added to this building of the Mishkan to make it the way it should be. So, on the one hand, as we strive to do as the Jews had done in the desert, we want to do kasher tzivah Hashem Moshe. We want to do it exactly as God had commanded. But at the same time, we want to always take a broader perspective and say, what is the goal here? What is the goal of this mitzvah? If the goal of Shabbat is to be closer with God, then I better not be stepping on anyone else as I'm observing Shabbat, as I'm preparing for Shabbat. I better not be yelling at my spouse or my children as I'm preparing for Shabbat, because that's not the goal of Shabbat. If the idea of tefillin is to be holy and have holy thoughts, I better make sure I say good morning to someone when maybe they walk in and they're new in the shul and they need an extra hand. So we can do as God commanded, but we always have to be a little bit like Bezalel, taking the broader considerations and thinking about how should we do it? How is it best executed so I can indeed do exactly as God commanded? And what's the goal of it all? What's the purpose of it all? Make sure that these details, which I'm trying to fulfill also the ultimate goals as well. Pointed out during the week that we often think of There's halacha, and of course, halacha, Jewish law is very punctilious. There are particular ways to put on your tefillin. There are particular ways to observe Pesach, observe Purim, observe the Seder night. And then there's this crazy thing that in the Mishkan, there are all these details. And we say, what do you need all these details for? What is that all about? And we forget that it's the same Torah. It's the same Torah. As a matter of fact, it might be a model for doing mitzvot. The book of Shemot begins with a ragtag 70 Jews coming down to Egypt. They become a freed nation. They get the Torah. And with all that, we're supposed to be doing all these different details. And then as an example, not as a separate standalone thing of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, but as an example of doing the mitzvot, we have a project to do. We do it as God commanded. And then God rests among us. And the idea is that we believe that by following God's command, we're in the shadow of God. God said, go right, and I go right. And with that, I'm in conversation with God. With that, we hope God will dwell among us. He'll feel like I asked him to do this mitzvah. He did it. And now he's in my shadow. He's in my orbit. And we shouldn't be surprised of all the details of the Mishkan, because that's the idea of Torah. And others may not appreciate it. They may think it's weird, it's overdone, there's too much. But we say, no, it's great to have so many mitzvot, because with all these mitzvot, we have opportunities to try to be in the shadow of God for each one of these acts. To put on tefillin, as God commanded. To do Shabbat, as God commanded. To eat the food, as God commanded. And so the Mishkan is no different. Mishkan is the way of book where we got the Torah, ending off by saying the Jews did it. They did it exactly as commanded. Some of the people have an even greater vision that you can't always just follow the details. You have to make sure you get it right so that it's in proper proportion and it's in the right order and everything fits in its place. And ultimately, that it fulfills its goal. And the goal is to be close with God. The goal is to have God rest with us. The goal is to be in the shadow of God like Mitzalel. If we can do that, then hopefully Moshe will continue to bless us, and he will ask that God should dwell among us in our homes as we observe Shabbos, in our tables as we observe kosher, in our schools as we learn Torah, and in all of our lives that are imbued with the spirit of Kasher Tzivah Hashem Moshe, where we always ask, what did God command? Hopefully, we live up to that standard. Hopefully, we will indeed be blessed with God's presence in everything that we do. Thank you for joining us here at the Baron Hirsch Congregation. Join us each week for a discussion of the Parsha and the holidays. Soon we'll be talking more about Pesach. And thanks to Jason Lefkowitz, our producer. Thank you.
This has been 10 Minutes for Torah with Rabbi Joel Finkelstein.